Good morning to everyone. This morning, I will be sharing probably one of the least appreciated and talk about topic. I decided not to talk on climate change, which is really at the heart of my work, but on my first love, which is actually forestry, because many years back, I earned my Bachelor of Science in Forestry, and probably some of our young minds may not even uh, understand or may not even know that there is such the science and practice of forestry. So essentially, my focus is the contribution of social science in the field of forestry. And the outline of my talk will include five aspects. One is very quickly showing the importance of forest ecosystems. Then I'll move to science and practice of forestry. I call here traditional versus social forestry, the role of social forestry in sustainable forest management, uh, which is in support of the Millennium Ecosystem goals, and also a final slide on my take-home message. Let me start by saying that the world has a total forest area of 4.06 billion hectares, which is actually 31% of the total land area of 13 billion hectares. Forest ecosystems provides valuable products and services that are key to human well-being and the survival of humankind. In terms of livelihood and income, close to 1.6 billion people, or more than 25% of the world's population, rely on forest resources for livelihoods. And most of them, actually 1.2 billion, use trees on farms to generate food and cash. Moreover, many countries in the world, particularly in the developing world, draw on fuel wood to meet as much as 90% of their energy requirements. Of course, we are more familiar with with the role of wood and timber in human civilization. We said in forestry, from cradle to grave, we use wood and timber. But in addition to that, uh, a significant portion of the people in the world use energy, particularly fuel wood, and in fact, more than 90% in general of their energy requirements come from trees and the forests. Our students may also be familiar with the ecosystem services that the forests provide, such as we are aware of the so-called biodiversity and essentially probably future cure to cancer and other diseases may actually be at the heart of the tropical forests. And there are actually 18 mega diverse countries of the world where two-thirds of the Earth's biodiversity can be found. And the good news is the Philippines belong to those mega diverse countries or 18 mega diverse countries of the world. Uh, and essentially, these countries contain two-thirds of the Earth's biodiversity. Between 70 to 80% of the plant and animal species in the world can be found just in these areas. We are also aware with the advent of climate change, and this is really the area that I'm working on, that forest ecosystems sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and therefore we called it as carbon sink. Oh. So they store carbon and therefore contribute to climate change mitigation. Clear, clean air and water quality, forest has the capacity to purify air and water as well. And so it also belongs to the forest ecosystem services. Natural calamities and disaster can also be prevented or help prevented uh, in terms of the ability of the forest to, in a way, absorb excessive water or runoff, but at the same time to serve as shelter belt, including mangrove areas in terms of typhoons and other forms of disasters. Of course, forests provide cultural services as well in terms of recreation, cultural values, spirituality, and so on. So these are just some of the many important things that are contributed by forests that contributes to human survival. In the Philippines, it is important to note that in fact, 53% of our total land area are classified as forest lands. In other words, this has been declared by the Philippine government to be solely dedicated for forest lands, for growing trees, and in order to promote both the products and the different ecosystem services that I had mentioned earlier. The rest are so-called alienable and disposable land, which include private lands, agricultural lands, lands for settlement, and so on and so forth. Now, as I've mentioned, probably many of our young attendees to this webinar may not be aware that there is the so-called forestry science. And the science of forestry really aims to develop knowledge for the effective protection, management of the forests to provide the required products and ecological services for the benefit of the society. And this is where the social dimensions of forest management comes in. And we have forestry as a profession, and in fact, this is uh, uh, there is the official recognition of forestry as a profession. So we take foresters board examination, and as a profession, forestry embraces the science and art as well as the practice of creating, managing, using, and conserving forests and related resources for human benefits in a sustainable manner to meet desired goals, needs, and values. This is according to Helms on the Dictionary of Forestry, and really at the heart of the forestry profession. Now, quickly, let me mention that we have the so-called traditional forestry. That's the old paradigm of forestry. And when I was doing my Bachelor of Science in Forestry, we are still under this particular paradigm, which focuses mainly on the technical aspects, biophysical, but have essentially equated, in the context particularly of the Philippines, forestry in terms of timber exploitation. That is logging for economic development and profit maximization. No? So on the one hand, the emphasis on trees and forest resources exploitation has really provide more access to the relatively elite sector of the society to enjoy the benefits of the forest resources, whereas on the other hand, the forest dependent communities were marginalized and in fact, in my term, in fact criminalized as the culprits for forest destruction because earlier policies in forestry have put the blaming fingers to the local communities as the culprit of forest destruction. No? So this is the trend in the Philippine forest land allocation and forest cover change. As you can see in here, this is, well, at the earlier, when the Spanish conquered the Philippines, essentially 90% of the total land area of the country, around more than 28 or 29 million hectares, are still covered with forest vegetation. Through time, particularly post-World War II, it went down significantly to 6.2 million hectares. And it's worth emphasizing the fact that particularly in 1959 to 1960s, and I want to highlight this, more than 30% of the world export of logs available in the international market came from the Philippines alone. And I again repeat, more than 30% of the world export of logs available in the international market came from the Philippine forest alone. No? And that has essentially resulted to massive land degradation, but also dissemination of our forests to our current level. No? What is interesting, though, is in terms of allocation of forest land, particularly during the martial law period, where more than 10 million of the 30 million hectares of the total land area was actually allocated to 170 or so logging concessionaires. We call them timber license agreements. So they are the more monetized, politically connected elite that apply for timber concessions. And during that time, I think a single timber concessionaire can actually have as much as, just for one concession, as much as 99,000 hectares, no, of public forest land under his care, primarily for exploitation. No? So essentially, that's what had happened, where more than, again, during the martial law years, where more than 30%, yes, 30% of the total land area of the country was actually under the hands of these concessionaires. And as a result of that, you can see the parallel trend, the strong correlation between elite control and also the degradation of the country's forest resources. And therefore, in the new constitution, the principle of social justice demanded that there should be more attention to be given to the forest-related needs of local communities, and hence the emergence of what we call now as the community-based forest management. I captured a little of it in terms of this graph here. This is now the area under community-based forest management. And as the areas in community forest management increases, correspondingly, you can see also that there is a subsequent increase in terms of forest cover in the country. So, and hence the birth of social forestry, not only in the Philippines, but in many parts of the world. And I'm glad to say that we are at the forefront of advancing the science and practice of social forestry in the Philippines. So when we talk about social forestry, it's an alternative form of forest management that balances the needs of the local people with multiple external interests. It considers local people as key partners in forest management while also advancing social equity and justice. No? That the local communities who are dependent on the forest for their livelihood and survival also should have access and benefits from the forest resources. Social forestry as a science uses social science disciplines such as sociology in terms of understanding human behavior and the broader structural context that shapes what happen or do not happen in the forestry sector, anthropology in terms of culture, forest interaction and understanding them, political science in terms of governance of forest resources, demography in terms of forest dependent communities, economics in terms of allocation of resources, particularly to the less marginalized sector, to the more marginalized sector, and other branches of social science. First, in terms of understanding forestry issues, but also in terms of managing forests sustainably. And above this, social forestry also asks the question, for whom should forestry be? So it is important, social forestry privilege the role of local communities in forest management. This points out to the importance of local communities, which include, among others, the following. Local communities have greater stake in forest protection and conservation since they depend on the forest for livelihood and survival. They have access to forest benefits by the poor, providing access to forest benefits by the poorest of the poor, that is the forest dependent communities, will also help alleviate poverty and address social inequity in the society. And also, local communities possess a storehouse of indigenous and local knowledge, it should be possessed, and experience as well as which are valuable for sustainable forest management. If you look at the world and the forest resources which are intact all over the world, including the Philippines, chances are that those intact forests are actually under the management of local communities, particularly the indigenous peoples group. So we argue here that social forestry is at the heart of what is now called a sustainable forest management. When we talk about sustainable forest management, we want to meet the forest-related needs of the present and also of the future generation. So we talk about what is called here as intra and intergenerational equity. So sustainable forest management is the overall goal of modern forestry, and social forestry is at the heart of the pillars of sustainable forest management, namely sociocultural. We need to understand the sociocultural context and the needs, as well as the culture forest interaction, particularly of the forest dependent communities, so that their culture, but as well as their livelihood, may continues to be sustained through time. Social forestry is also at the heart of understanding resource allocation in forestry and privileging the more marginalized sector in the process. And the last of the three pillars, social forestry is at the heart of sustainable forest management because the rich indigenous knowledge and practices are actually, when incorporated to modern science, can essentially confront the challenges of environmental degradation in many parts of the tropical forests. So my take-home message are the following. Forests provide multiple goods and services that are key to human well-being and survival. Traditional forestry science focused on technical aspects, neglecting the role of local people and communities in forest management. And finally, sustainable forest management can only be achieved by thinking beyond the trees. And this is the title of my presentation. And incorporating the social dimensions in the science and practice of forestry. Let me end by a quotation from Jacques Westoby, who is the acclaimed international architect of forestry, who once said in 1967, forestry is not about trees. It is about people. It is only about trees insofar as trees meet the needs of the people. Good morning and thank you very much.